Thank you. I guess we're going to jump back and forth between CEWs. I don't like the word taser because it's a brand name, and so I'll end up slipping back and referring to them as tasers, but they're conducted electronic weapons and police driving. I've divided the driving into crashes and pursuits because and I'm really going to bring you information from the States because I don't know enough about what you're doing here. I've read and talked to a number of you about situations in your own departments, but I really am not, don't consider myself up to speed, so to speak, on what you're doing here. So a lot of the relevance we're going to have to transfer. And that transfer, as I've learned in the 3 or 4 times I've been to Australia, it's not 100%. There are a lot of cultural differences. You don't have the kind of weapons we have on the street. I mean, with suspects having knives and guns and the attacks on police officers, the deaths, our police officer deaths are, last year was the first year that firearms took more officers than did traffic situations, and for the 20 years prior to that, crashes, vehicle issues killed more officers than did bullets. So it's kind of an interesting problem we have. And I've got a couple of videos that if we get to the end and we have time, I'll show you that it's to me sad that in the States we've got to make these videos to get police officers to think about things, but we have, and I'll show them to you. So I guess we should get started, or not, with a little discussion about these conducted electronic weapons. Now, the most recent jury refereed article that I've seen about the impact of the electricity was just published. I brought a copy of it for anyone who wants to make one, by Douglas Zipes, and he, in the American Heart Association journal, basically said that it is the electricity that can kill you. This has been controversial. If anyone here is from Taser, you'll be spending millions of dollars probably assassinating Dr. Zipes, because that's what Taser goes after, medical examiners who attribute the death to the device. That's been a trend. They've hired a lot of expert witnesses to go in and talk about the device, that it really isn't the electricity. But whichever side you fall on, the evidence now seems to be, according to this new article, seems to be going in that direction, that the electricity is something that can kill you, particularly with multiple applications. The legal standards in the states for the use of force, I don't think is much different than it is here. It's kind of a reasonable man standard. We don't know what a reasonable man is in the States, a reasonably well-trained officer, and we have some other legal issues that goes on in terms of both criminal and civil litigation. We see far more, and again, I hope Australia doesn't follow America in this regard, with the civil litigation. Anytime you're going to have a death, you're probably going to have a lawsuit, even if it's a righteous shooting, even if it's something that is normal. Some lawyer somewhere is going to take the case and file suit, and it's really caused a lot of problems for us in terms of dealing with police. But we do see in these cases, we do see in the evaluation of the CEWs, what I put up here are the issues of using it too early in a confrontation and using it too often in a confrontation. And those seem to be the ones that get the most attention. They seem to be the ones that get the most litigated, and they seem to be the ones that certainly get the most press. Now, let's go back for a minute in terms of too early. That's basically a policy issue. When is a CEW going to be authorized for your officers to use? Is it going to be, I grew up in Oregon, and we have a lot of tree huggers over there. So do you use a CEW on someone who's hugging a tree and just won't let go? Or, as we've seen more recently and more up to date, the Occupy movement, people who are just locked arms and not obeying what the police officer tells them. You just zap them with a taser and they let go. Well, Some states we do. Now remember, we have 17,000 departments, it gets kind of crazy, but some of our policies allow for that. Now most of them don't. Most of them have moved to what we call aggressive resistance. And we're not 100% sure what aggressive resistance means, but we're trying to get there. Secondly, and I'll come back to this, too often in a confrontation. How often is too often? How many cycles do you want to have that voltage going through someone's body, and what good is it going to do? And if it doesn't work after a couple of times, is it really going to work again? And so we've got some policies in some departments that basically say after the first one, you have to have some objective reason why you would do it again. What good is it doing? Can you cuff them under power? Can you take them into control? And why do you have to hit them again with electricity? And a third time. And after a third time, 15 seconds, it seems to be we have consensus that that's enough. Now, we do have as close to we can come as national standards. Mick Williams, Mick, where are you? There you are. We were in Philly together in 2011 under the guise of the Police Executive Research Forum, and we put together a series of national standards. Now, out of ignorance, do you have those here with the 8 departments? Do you have any kind of agreement or? There's not, okay. Well, that's something that maybe you should put on the table to think about. I guess ANSPA would be a one vehicle to do that. I don't know your other vehicles that have all of you in a room together. But our national standards, there are 50 of them. Do you remember? Is that all right? I think there are 50 of them, and they're pretty good. They talk about when a taser, well, there I go, sorry. When it is improper, and we're seeing obviously elevated situations. We saw a tragedy in New York when a person fell off a balcony and died, and then the officer who did it committed suicide. It was just a horrible, horrible tragedy. But on the other hand, what do you expect if you use a taser on someone who's 2 floors up? What do you expect when you use a CEW on someone riding a bicycle, driving a car? And what we're seeing now, I hate to do this on video, but we used to have in the States what's called a screen test. Do you guys have screens in your cars? The phantom dog would go across the road, you'd slam your brakes on, and the guy in the back seat would get hit with the screen. So now what they're doing with the tasers is if someone's running away from you and you shoot them in the back, what do you expect is going to happen? And if you're on concrete, if you're on a cement floor, he's running away in a parking lot, what do you think is going to happen when you hit someone in the back with a taser? Ideas? Huh? Yeah, you're going to faceplate him. There's no, at least when you tackle him, and I guess we could make a reference to tonight's game, but at least when you tackle someone, you have an ability to stop your fall. But when you've been hit with a CEW, you don't. You bam. And we've got cases after cases, and we're starting to get them even thinking about criminal cases, which I don't really approve, but certainly civil cases where officers have shot people in the back, they've face planted, if you will, and have serious injuries. And we've had several who've died, and they're all over YouTube. So we wonder about using a CEW too early, we wonder about using it too often, and we wonder about using it under certain circumstances. We've talked a lot in these national standards about populations who are at risk. Now in the States, we usually deal with pregnant women, although one of our courts upheld a woman being drive-stunned in her arm and in her breast. She was 7 months pregnant, and she wouldn't get out of her car. And the court said, well, under certain circumstances, that might be okay. She should have gotten out of the car. Other courts have said, no, that's not appropriate. You have an at-risk person. So there's some differences we see there. but we have a problem dealing with the mentally ill. We seem to use these devices on mentally ill people a lot, and it doesn't seem to work as well. Again, we talked about people who are elevated. We talk about people who are in excited delirium. And I don't know what that term means, but I read it all the time. And it seems to be a condition. I'll just say some guy is jacked up on some amphetamines and his body temperature is 104 degrees or whatever it is, and he has this, quote, superhuman strength. And these don't work well with those people. But you know what? They work really well with fit, young police officer types. And you go through training, and what we know about the use of a CEW has all been done with fit, young police officer types, because they're the ones that our research boards are going to let us get through. You start going into trying to use these on people who are overweight, who are taking some sort of drugs, and we don't know. And they're the ones, by the way, who seem to die. Now that said, one of the questions I ask when we see the deaths being reported and we see the deaths that are coming through on the forms, would this person have died anyway? Would this person have died anyway? If you're tackling him and you dogpile him and you're arresting him and you're fighting and you're compressing his chest and he's overweight, he can't breathe, would he have died? We don't know the answer. And that's something that should be asked when you have a CEW death. Now I'm going to make a comment that goes the other way. As we see in the States too, we see a lot of CEWs being used when someone should have been shot. There was a study that just came out in the States about officers using CEWs and other accoutrements, if you will, instead of using a firearm. And they were justified in using a firearm. And yeah, that's great. I mean, I think that's an important thing to look at, but at what risk? And I think that's something that we've got to look at as well. You don't want to bring a taser to a gunfight. And you don't want to be underarmed, so to speak, when you're dealing with someone who's threatening your life or someone else's life. So this balancing test is very awkward and very difficult. And again, I would call for some meetings of the mind among the 8, 9 agencies to figure out what's best. I mean, I don't care where you are in Australia or America, a taser still hurts. You know, even an old guy like me got hit with one, and it, next time I see that red dot, I'm going to quit. Now, let me make a little bit of a transition to the car issue. I saw 60 Minutes the other day, and it was kind of an interesting story. It was on the car chases. Was that is that one from New South Wales? The 60 Minutes showed? Victoria. You know, I thought, and I'm not going to comment on the chase at this point, but I was kind of listening. It was a show like what we would have a few years ago, and then the guy's sister basically said, well, specifically said, this wasn't my brother's fault. This was totally the police officer's fault. He didn't, he went 180, I'll get the facts wrong, 180 kilometers the wrong way on the freeway, right? Is that about? And that wasn't his fault. He was totally moved to do that by the police. Well, at that point, the show lost me. I mean, I think we've got to figure out, well, okay, we know as police departments people are going to run. We know as police officers people aren't going to do what they're told to do all the time, and how are we trained and what are our policies say to respond? Certainly to blame the police for getting this bad guy to go 180 kilometers an hour the wrong way on a freeway, it just made no sense. Now, is she setting up a lawsuit? Is she, Lord knows what she's doing. Does she really believe that? But my point here is we know people are not going to do what they're told to do, whether they're drunk, they're high, they're some combination. So how do you respond? How do you take them into control, and under what conditions is a CEW going to be used? And we'll come back to a policy discussion in a few minutes. The secondary injuries, I mentioned the elevated suspects, elevated areas, the face planting. What we learned from, I just finished a 4-year study funded by our Justice Department, and the term lazy cop syndrome, I wish I had thought it up, but I'm not that smart. It was a trainer in Seattle, Washington Police Department said, I've seen these guys come through, they can't use a taser, they can't fight, they can't drive, they probably shouldn't be cops, but they're lazy. They want the shortcut. They don't want to put hands on. They just want to control someone the easiest way, and putting 50,000 volts or whatever actually comes into your body is so much easier than doing it some other way, doing it the traditional way. These guys are the same ones, and I read these lawsuits. They say, well, we had no choice. There was no other way we could have done it. And I guess my comment to them is, well, what did you do 10 years ago? What did you do before you had this device? You know, and their answer is, well, we wrestle with them, and you know, you'd win the fight, didn't you? Yeah, we got bruised up. So injury. Now, most of the research done on these devices shows that injuries are reduced. But let's think about that for a minute. Injuries to officers are reduced. Well, yeah, if I'm fighting with you, or if I tell you to do something, you don't do it, and I zap you with a taser, and I get you handcuffed, well, I got no risk. Now, is he injured? One of the things we're seeing are the prongs. Are those injuries? Is that something that, and I don't mean in a sensitive area, I mean just right in the, you know, in the abdomen or in your back or in your side. Are the prongs, do you count those as injuries? We're starting to see that come into the discussion. I don't think they are. I think it's a kind of a natural consequence, but I may be in the minority on that one. There are some people thinking that those are injuries, and those are issues to think about. Obviously, if you get it in the eye or in the groin or something, you know, that's clearly an injury, but just a normal one. And they're fish hooks. I mean, I've had them pulled out. They hurt. I think they're the equivalent, any medical people in the group, they're the equivalent of a 3-needle, I think is what we call it. So anyway, we think about injuries, and we think about injuries to officers and injuries to suspects. Research coming out, again, in the States, is when you only use the CEW, yes, it reduces injuries to the officers almost all the time. But if you're involved in a multiple use of force situation where you're using a CEW and you're fighting and you're using some other device, then the injuries to the officers are not reduced. And the injuries to suspects are not reduced. So if it's only a CEW, yes, but when you start getting into a more complicated situation, then it's not as good a device as you might think. Charlotte, North Carolina, 6 months ago, 3 people died within a 2-week period. To me, it's a fascinating situation because it's what we would call a natural experiment. The chief pulled tasers, said, no more tasers until we figure this out. So we went in as a team to look at what they were doing, and several things came clear. While tasers were off the streets, crime didn't just explode. Nothing really happened that was any different. Yeah, there were more injuries with baton strikes, and there were more injuries with people tackling people. Not a significant. It spiked a little bit and then went back to normal. They now have tasers back on the streets, and we're starting to see, you know, there was no change in crime, by the way. So it was just a matter of making it easier for the officer to use and control people with or without these devices. So we're going to analyze these data a little more thoroughly and see really what happened and interview some of the officers, how they dealt with it without having, you know, it's like taking a toy away from a little kid for a while. How do you react to it? So we're looking at these rates of injuries. We're trying to figure out what is an injury. We're trying to figure out, do these things really help? And are they worth the money when you could be spending that money doing something else? And that's a rhetorical question, because I don't know the answer. I don't know how much help they are in terms of how much danger they cause. I'm going to end the conversation on this with a, has anyone read the Braithwaite Commission from Canada? Of course. This was a young Polish guy who was killed in the Vancouver, BC airport. And it's a really good, if you're interested in this whole issue of taser use, it's a really good report. One of the say dissenting or responding views was written by an emergency room doctor named Christina Hall. She's married to a cop, so maybe she's a little biased, but she's a really bright and thoughtful person. She said, as a medical professional in the emergency room, I don't choose who my patients are. They come into me for whatever reason, and I assess them. I figure out what I'm going to do, and every procedure I use on that person in my emergency room is risky. Sometimes I lose them. Sometimes they die. I don't mean to kill them, but sometimes they die, and sometimes because what I did may not have been the best option at the time. With the what do you call it? We call it hindsight, 20/20 hindsight. You call it hindsight, yep. Whatever. And with hindsight, maybe I should have done something else. But at the time, when things were fast, when people were screaming, when monitors were going off, I did what I thought was right, and I've lost them. Everything I do has a risk, and that's what the cops do too. And she says every time you have this interaction, yeah, you have a risk, and what you do, there may be more risk based on some things you do and less risk on others. So I thought that was a really thoughtful idea and something that we need to consider when we're talking about these things. And then throw into the mix, and again, I got this from her idea, is the health of people. She says, I can't control how healthy these people are. I get in there and I crack a chest and I look and, there's just nothing there. It's horrible. It's a degenerate heart or lungs or whatever's collapsed. I didn't know that until I got in there, and now I've got this person with anyway. So you have the same issues. When you are facing someone who has bad health issues but is still aggressive toward you and you need to control that person, how much do you consider dealing with that health problem? How much are you supposed to? How do I know if this woman's pregnant? She doesn't look pregnant. How do I know this person has a bad ticker? He doesn't have a big sign on his chest saying, I've got a heart, whatever those things are. So how do you know? And where does health come into it, physical and mental health? And that's an issue that's got to be somehow discussed, and also it's a public education issue. If I'm out there as a baddie, is that right? If I'm out there as a baddie, or as in Brisbane, I've learned Fortitude Valley or the Gold Coast, or I'm sure you all have your fun areas like that, and I'm out acting like an idiot, yeah, it's my fault. A police officer comes up to me and tells me to do something, and I, basically don't do it. I keep forgetting I'm on video here. I don't do it. Well, whose fault is it? Is it yours, Peter? Like to think that I ought to be doing what he tells me. But if I don't, he's got to be prepared. What do I do? What levels of force can I use? How much force can I use? And at what point do I start using that force? Where do I start talking, and when do I stop talking? And that's an issue that I think, I would like to see a discussion, as we have in the States, among a variety of agencies, at least the 8 or 9 you have here, to try to get some consistency. So we'll come back to the CEWs in a minute and move to pursuits. Now, for some reason, I've been studying police pursuits since 1982, right before some of you were born. Kind of ridiculous, but we started looking at pursuits in Miami when one of the police chiefs came to me and basically said, hey, look, this is a problem we're going to have in this department. And I kind of looked at him and I said, well, what's a pursuit? What are you talking about? I really wasn't aware that it was a problem. He picked up, he really understood that there was a problem with pursuits. They had 600 pursuits a year at the time with maybe 2,500, 3,000 officers. 40% were ending in crashes, 20% in injuries, and 1 in death, 1%. So they were killing people, I say regularly, but 40% of the pursuits ended in a crash. So we started looking, and our research went way beyond Miami, but it's a good city to study because of what happened. And the bottom line that we look at in the States is this balancing test. And I went back through as far as I could find, and we got back to the 1950s in our courts records, and found a case that had to do with a milk wagon in 1952 in Kentucky, where this guy was driving a milk wagon, and police officers, because they saw someone whom they suspected as being a baddie, no other reason, decided to chase. And the guy took off because he had didn't want to get caught or didn't want to deal with the cops, ran into the milk wagon, and they held the police officers responsible. This is 1950. They said and basically said it was the police officers' actions that was a proximate cause of the crash. Now, they didn't give him a money damage. They didn't, at the time, that wasn't part of it. They fined the bad guy who was fleeing, but that was the first case I ever read in the 1950s that said it is the police officers, their action is what contributed to this crash. So we've seen that go from the 80s up until now. And we have 17,000 departments, 700 and some 100,000 police officers, and many are operating under totally different policies. So we've come to the conclusion from our research that balance, where everyone comes under the balancing test, the need to apprehend and the risk. Well, what is the need to apprehend? Very simply, it's what this person did. And it's the crime for which the police know, and this is where it gets a little wonky, if you will. It's not what you think. You don't put people's lives at risk because you think he may have done something. You don't put people's lives at risk on a whim. So you've got to act on what you know. At least in the States, that's the standard. And then you look at the risks created by the chase. In other words, it boils down to traffic. It boils down to, are people out there on the road? I got laughed at one of these things because I said, well, I wouldn't even chase a speeder, in Texas. And he says, well, what if you have 8 lanes of traffic and no one's on it? I said, well, you're certainly risking your own life and you're risking the life of the guy fleeing from you and if you run across someone. But it's different, and it's different. You have different regions in this country as well, but certainly in the cities, you can expect traffic all the time. We have in our highways and outside in our suburban areas, bars let out. We're a little more sensible. Our bars let out at 2 o'clock in the morning for the most part, and they close them down. At 2 o'clock in the morning, you're going to expect a lot of traffic. Factories that go 24/7, you can expect traffic. So the risk has to do with not only what you see, but what you should know. And those risk factors are balanced. So what a lot of chiefs have done in the States is taken that, and instead of making an officer make a split-second decision during the heat of the chase, as they call it, during the adrenaline-driven event that you all know better than I, and they've basically said, I'm going to make that decision for you. And I think some of the states here have done that, and they've restricted them to violent events. We made that suggestion in 1994, 1995, and again, the department where I kind of cut my teeth in Miami-Dade, they changed the policy in '92 and went from 500 or 600 pursuits a year to 40. Crime rate didn't change. There are 2 myths that we debunked, and again, this is in the States, I didn't hear. The 2 myths that we debunked were that 1, there's not a dead body in every trunk. In other words, just because some idiot runs from you doesn't mean that he's committed a serious homicide or a serious crime even. And 2, if you don't chase, everyone's going to run from you. And we know that's not true. There are a certain group of people who will run from you anytime. Now, have we created another class of people who will run once the policy is known? I don't think so. We saw in a couple cities where they did that car thefts went up, but it turned out in those cities, particularly Tampa, Florida, the cars were going to the boats, in the dock. They were being sent to South America. The joyriding, there was some of that. They'd flip the cops off, and they knew they weren't going to be chased. But it wasn't a big deal, and it kind of went back a little bit. There was a spike in it, and it went back. So we know those 2 are myths for the most part. Not everyone's gonna run because you don't chase, and not everyone's committed a serious crime. In fact, we find 80% of our chases across the United States are still for traffic, and you wonder, what's the real need to immediately apprehend? As we get more traffic cameras, we're seeing, identification being made a lot easier, and we're seeing we're able to solve more of these pursuits, and we're able to capture more of those people who flee, who don't stop when the police turn on their lights. Which brings up 2 issues. 1, how much of a resource are you willing to put into capturing someone who flees from you? How serious is it when that person flees, and what's going to happen to them? And I will tell you, the thing that makes me and a lot of my police friends the most angry is when someone gets charged with a crime. In some states, it's still a misdemeanor. I mean, it means nothing. And then the prosecutor in many places will just plea bargain it away. and then you've got absolutely nothing. Now, the U.S. Supreme Court did say that fleeing from the police is a violent crime. And that doesn't justify you to chase. It's a sentencing issue. It's not a justification to run, and they said that pretty clearly. But I think these plea bargains, and I think making this a non-serious matter is we're just way beyond that. And I don't know, again, how you handle it here, but to me it's a very serious crime. It should have very serious and swift consequences. Fleeing the police is a dangerous event. Now, that said, let's go back for a minute. If you as a police officer knows, and you as a police policymaker know that people are going to flee from you, people are not going to do what they're told to do, either standing on the sidewalk and or in a vehicle, how are you trained to respond? To go after them and chase them till the wheels fall off? Well, I hope not. To go after them and beat the crap out of them because they didn't do what they were told to do? I hope not. So you've got to have a reasoned approach, and you've got to be prepared for those people who aren't going to do what they're told to do. And how you respond is going to reduce the risk or increase the risk. When I train officers in pursuit decision making, and I've gotten well, let me back up for a minute. How about drunk drivers? Do you chase drunk drivers? Drunk driving you call it drink driving, is a very serious offense. We're at .08, you're at .05. So, we can have an extra beer because your beer is so much better than ours anyway. But we get, .08 is a lot higher than .05. All right, so it's a very serious offense. I can't tell you how many deaths are attributed to drink driving in the States. And I remember giving a talk to we have MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. It's an advocacy group. This woman came up to me and I was giving a talk about pursuits, and she was shaking. I was just, oh God, here we go. She's going to thump me for, kind of talking about pursuit issues. She said she lost her son to a drunk driver who had been chased. And she said there's only one thing more dangerous than a drunk on the road, and that's a drunk being chased by a cop. It took me a while to figure all that out, but if you're not driving well at 40, how are you doing at 60? How are you doing at 80? You're not making good decisions. And if you're going to keep running, and I think the dynamic of these pursuits are that people will continue to run as long as you continue to chase. And as long as you continue to chase, someone's going to run. And that person who's running, we know from our research, is most likely looking in the rearview mirrors, trying to see what the police officer's doing, glued to the rearview mirror, which means what? Not paying attention to what's in front of them. And that's where the event occurs. When we talk about this decision making with police officers, one of the things I bring up, and it's a sad thing, but if your daughter or your son were injured or killed in a pursuit that was being done by one of your fellow officers for a traffic offense, how would you feel? How would you take that personally? You've just lost a child for what? A traffic offense? Everyone out there has a mother, a father, a brother, a sister. And it's interesting, and again, I can only speak to the States, when we have a politician's kid who's killed, all of a sudden this thing is hot. And policies are changed. We had Congressman Dorgan from South Dakota, his mother was killed in a pursuit, and millions of dollars were spent on training. Policies were changed. I mean, the whole world changed in pursuit because this politician's mother was killed. We see it when other high-profile people are injured or killed, and that's just not right. That's just, why is that life more important than another? So the balance we get to has to be done in thinking about the risks and in thinking about the benefits. And also keeping in mind the myths. And I'd be interested to see, and we've talked, Peter and I have talked a lot, and Mark and I have talked a lot about looking at some of these statistics here and seeing if they're the same as we have in the States, seeing if crime rates change when you do or do not pursue. I can only direct you, if anyone's really interested, to Orlando, Florida, where they kept track. The chief got so fed up, he put together a public forum of businessmen, police officers. I came in as their subject matter expert, and they developed the policy. He just said, whatever you guys come up with, I'm going to do because I'm getting it from both sides. They created a very restrictive policy. I think it's one of the best ones we have in the country. They kept track of how many people fled, how many people were chased, how many people weren't chased, and the crime rates. And it made absolutely no difference to the crime rates. A few people started fleeing in the first few months, but then it went back to its normal number. Didn't make any difference, and they rarely chase. And even half of the chases they get in are ruled to be improper because it doesn't fit the policy. And then these officers are disciplined, and hopefully they don't do it again. And I think it's important not to look at what our statistics tell us, because it's a different world, so to speak, but to find out what you're doing. Find out what's going on in your different states and what the statistics show, and then make that balance fit your situation. And I think while in the states we're moving toward the policy that restricts pursuits to violent crimes, I kind of draw the line in the sand at that. I think officers, we train our officers in firearms 2, 3, 4 times a year, and most officers never use a firearm in the line of duty. 36 and a half years is about what we figure for an officer to use a firearm, and I assume it's less here. But we train them pretty well. We don't train them very well in pursuits. A lot of them don't even know they can drive, but they don't even know their own policies, and they don't know when they can chase and when they can't chase. And that seems to be our biggest problem. So I guess my suggestion is to figure out what you have in terms of your data, figure out what is that best balance for you. I think, again, like with the conducted electronic weapon, it's a public opinion issue. We did some surveys in the states where we asked people how much they support pursuits, and it was overwhelming. They're very supportive unless their own family's involved or something, but that's okay. Then we educated, we did a split sample, what it's called. We educated another group and told them how many pursuits were in your department had, how many people were injured, how many people were killed, and remarkably and predictably, that support for pursuits eroded. Well, if you're killing that many people, if so many people are getting injured, if this amount of money has been spent on fixing cars and, et cetera, maybe it's not such a good idea. So I think it becomes, people talk about public opinion, but if you educate the public, you see two different publics. When Miami switched, the last comment I'll make on this, when Miami switched its policy, and I followed it most closely, although I've seen it in other areas as well. When Miami changed its policy, the first thing you heard when a sergeant would shut down the pursuit, you'd hear on the radio, bok, 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 bok. You'd hear click, click, click. You'd hear all this noise from other officers. And that was dealt with, and people were disciplined. And now, most of these officers have not been in a pursuit. It's not an issue. The young ones who've been trained, they've gone through the ranks, they're probably in 8, 10 years into their career, never been in a pursuit. Letting someone go isn't a big deal. It takes time. Older officers who are still on the street, they want to go home at night. They're not going to get involved in very many pursuits unless it's for a really serious offense. But you have this cohort of kind of mid-range officers, and again, I would challenge you to see what's going on here, who were trained to pursue for everything, trained to pursue till the wheels fall off, and really not trained well and explain why they shouldn't be chasing. They're the ones who seem to get in the most precarious pursuits. So it's a cultural change, a work environment change in the department. Now, one point there, and everyone I've talked to here, except over several beers, tells me police officers wear your seatbelts. Now, we've had a discussion over a few beers once in a while, and some of them say, well, yeah, not as much as I should, or sometimes I don't. We have this horrible, horrible habit in the States of police officers, even though the policy is there, even though they're seen under camera driving out of the parking garage with their seatbelts on, they take them off. The phantom ninja, and it seems to be prevalent where police officers don't wear seatbelts. And I've got a couple of videos, if we have time at the end, I'll show you that to me, I've never seen a group of grown men cry before and grown women cry because of this problem in the video that was produced to kind of explain it. But we kill a lot of officers in these things. A lot of officers die, as as I mentioned before, by traffic and in pursuits, and a lot of them don't have seatbelts on. So that's an issue that we're dealing with. Finally, whoops. We're looking and we're working with California Post, who, by the way, California Post is the training oversight. This is all the training for the 685 departments in California. They're the ones who've made this. We're looking with them at pursuits and traffic crashes in terms of officer decisions, officer attitudes, and culture of the departments. And we're seeing departments that are very similar, have very high rates of crashes, and other ones that have very low rates of crashes. And we're trying to figure out why. And yeah, they have the same level of crime, they have the same geographic issues, and some crash their cars at far different rates. And we're trying to figure that out. We've studied the use of helicopters. I read the other day that Queensland now is going to have to pay for it themselves. It seemed like, I guess the government had promised them and then said, figure out from where.
A little bit of political machinations from the Gold Coast mayor at times.
Yeah. So we found that helicopters were really important ways they were expensive, but they were important ways to manage pursuits. And Mark, you just had one, oh, there you go. You just had one last week, I guess. That's right. And the helicopter saved it, it seems like. And it seemed like it managed well with a lot of close calls, and that's what we saw in a lot of our research. I guess I'm the only one around who was given a grant to study helicopters. So in Baltimore and Miami, I got to fly around in helicopters for a couple of months. But it was amazing to see how well setting up not just in a pursuit issue, but setting up perimeters, where you could see this guy who is now being chased for an armed robbery or something, and you could see it. We fly them at 500 feet, and you could just see where the officers were going. You could see the heat sensing. They're very effective. They're very expensive, but again, in America, we're using former military helicopters. They just give them to the police department because we've got so many left over from Vietnam. Maybe you guys can get them over here. Oops. One last point I wanted to bring up. We're seeing a huge problem with foot pursuits. LA Sheriff's Department, which is a big agency, I think there are 20,000 officers. No, maybe not that many. Anyway, for us, it's a big agency, 10,000 officers. They basically have restricted foot pursuits because officers were getting ambushed. They go around a corner and someone would meet them with a 2x4. Be like a cricket match, right? So we're seeing that injuries and deaths, and we're responding to foot pursuits. I don't know if it's a problem here, and I didn't realize it was really a problem at home until they started coming out with these statistics, and it's kind of the hot issue now that we haven't seen before, and I would just keep your eye open on that one. This last slide basically just talks about how we do this research, and that we've established as an academic, we established pretty good partnerships with the police agencies, and Peter was seconded to SEPS as a police fellow, and did a really wonderful job of bridging the gap between academics and police work, and that's how we kind of figure out what questions to ask and how best to ask them. And speaking of questions, I'll answer any I can.